Hi, this is Max Haag, and in this interview with Anders Ericsson, you will learn how to become an expert using deliberate practice, the actual study and the true meaning of the famous 10,000 hour rule, and out of 16,000 books, what is his favorite book? Besides talking about his own works, I also ask him about the relationship between deliberate practice and flow and the concept of deep work. Enjoy this interview. Dr. Cal Anders Ericsson received a PhD in psychology from the University of Stockholm, Sweden. He's a professor of psychology at Florida State University, and for over 4 decades, Anders Ericsson studied expert performers across all disciplines, from sports stars to memory experts to world-class musicians to scientists and more. He concluded studies on long-term working memory and the acquisition of expert performance. Anders Ericsson and co-authors also conducted the study upon which the famous 10,000 hour rule by Malcolm Gladwell was based. Together with Robert Poole, he published his latest book, Peak: Secrets from the New Science of Expertise, and he's got 62,309 citations on Google Scholar. Welcome, Anders Ericsson.
It's a pleasure talking to you.
And I checked the number on Google Scholar like 2 days ago. It was 62,150. And in 2 days, it went up by 159.
Well, I'm glad that people are citing our work, and and I think that is stimulating some interesting discussions, and hopefully it will stimulate some new research.
Yeah. So for the very few people who don't know and your work, could you give us a summary in your own words? What are you doing?
Well, I think what we've been doing is trying to identify things that some people are able to do that other people can't do. So we're kind of starting out here using an objective measurement here of performance. So if you look at athletes, some athletes can run faster than others, and it's not, like the less successful athletes aren't trying hard enough. Basically, you have a fundamental difference in their performance, and we've been looking at memory expert, some individuals who can actually perform so much better on various memory tests, and we've been looking at all sorts of professionals that are actually able to do things that other people can't. And basically, that's kind of the starting point. And then we've tried to bring people into the laboratory where we give them tasks where the performance is highly correlated now with their objective performance out in the real world. And we ask them to think out loud and do various experimental tasks to kind of pinpoint what is it that they have that other people don't have. And then basically, we've been looking at what is the path that these individuals has taken, and is that path different from people who end up with a lower level of performance? And that's how we've basically been able to identify various types of very effective practice. So one would be purposeful practice, where you actually set a goal and find a task here where you can get immediate feedback. And we also distinguish now, when you're engaging in that type of training, and you're basing it now with basically directions here and guidance from a teacher who has been able to help other individuals reach the performance that you aspire to attain.
Yeah, great. I would ask you later also more about the difference between the different types of practices. What I was wondering, how did you get so passionate, so obsessed in a positive way about this whole topic of experts and expertise?
Well, I think I'm not the only one who would like to be very good at what you're doing. So I think that's something that, I've always sort of wondered about, how is it that some people that I really admire, that they're able to do what they're doing. And over basically trying out some things during my adolescence, I got more and more interested in science. And I guess I started reading biographies of people that I really admired. and was basically trying to ask, what is it that kind of allowed them to do something, at the level that I would aspire to do. And as we basically then, I got involved and did my PhD, I looked at, to what extent are things fixed, or to what extent can you actually change things like memory? And that's basically where I kind of started the work when I was able to get a postdoc here in the United States. So we basically train now an average individual who, over about 200 to 400 hours of training, was able to get to a point that was actually the best in the world at the time. And what we basically found was that the kinds of thinking and the kind of training environment that you need in order to kind of achieve that improvement seemed to be sort of different from how most people spend, time practicing. And then, I basically started to look at all sorts of domains to try to look, is this possibly something that is relevant here to acquisition of expertise in any domain? And I've basically been looking at a wide range of different domains personally, but there's also a large number of other researchers who've been using similar kind of ideas and conceptions. So now I think we have a very broad basis here on research and expertise across the entire board. So as long as you can demonstrate that somebody can actually objectively do something that is reproducibly superior to other individuals, then basically you have something that would be relevant to our theoretical approach. It's important to realize that some of the things that, if you say that you're more intelligent than somebody else, what does that mean? I mean, how can we actually objectively prove that you're more intelligent? Well, I guess one way would be say, okay, so if I can give you one of the many IQ tests and you do better than everyone else, well, that would be sort of evidence. But once you start thinking hard about that, most people are interested in intelligence that applies now to your ability to perform various kinds of tasks. So some people might even argue here that to be a really good chess player, you would need a lot of intelligence, so you would be able now to generate the best moves. And what we're finding is that once you start looking at extremely good chess players, they're very good at playing chess. And we can actually identify the processes that they engage in order to select very good chess moves. But that doesn't, transfer to basically being a good surgeon or basically being successful in another domain. So that's why, I would argue that when you're talking about things like intelligence, you really have to link it to something that we can actually reproducibly measure in order for it to be meaningful.
Okay, great. And one of your main concepts that you talk a lot about is deliberate practice. And you talk about practice, purposeful practice, deliberate practice. Can you give us an overview and talk about also what's the difference between these types of practice?
Well, so if you engage now in doing something, and a lot of amateur tennis players and golfers, they kind of go out and just play the game, and they call that sort of practicing. And they may go to maybe the green and putt, but basically, I guess they really don't have kind of very clear idea here of what is it that they want to change. So in our conception, where you're actually looking now at objective performance, from that, you can now work yourself backwards. So if you're at this level in terms of your ability to putt golf balls at a distance of, basically like, 3 meters or something like that, then you can actually measure and see, can I actually get to a point here now where in a month, I'm actually more accurate in actually getting golf balls to come close to the hole than I was previously. And that is kind of now capturing this idea here of deliberate practice, that you're actually setting up a goal that's measurable objectively. And then the question is, what is it that you should be doing here in order to actually now reach this higher level of performance than you're currently able of exhibiting.
And so this would be deliberate practice, right?
So deliberate practice would be when you actually do have a teacher that is skilled and actually has helped other individuals make that path to the improved performance. So if you don't have a teacher, you can, guess and experiment with things that you can train. And we call that purposeful practice because it doesn't have that assurance that you, based on, because you're doing it for the first time, you don't really know whether you're engaging in the most effective practice or not. So just to give one example that I think is an instructive. So if you want to dunk the ball, a lot of individuals would now repeatedly try to jump up and dunk the ball. And that turns out not to be the most effective way if you want to increase your ability here to jump high. Far more effective is if you do weight training. So when you have weights, you put now a lot of pressure on your legs as you're basically lifting the weight. And that stimulation seems to now cause physiological change that increases your strength. And basically that in turn allows you now to jump higher. Another thing that you can do is actually jump down from kind of a reasonably height, because when you have to absorb your body as you're reaching the ground, that will also stimulate now your leg muscles. So over time, they will actually become more stronger, and that will allow you now to be able to jump higher.
Okay, nice. Another concept you mention a lot is mental representation. What is the mental representation?
Well, I think a lot of people, when they do something for a long time, it's almost that it becomes automatic, and they basically are more or less relying now of, intuition or the sense here of what they should be doing. What we're finding is that those people who keep improving, they actually have a very detailed representation where they actually pay attention to all the different relevant cues. So if you're basically a basketball player, it's really key that you can actually know where your teammates is, even if they're not actually within your vision. So by basically moving your head, you can now, in your head, have a representation of where they're at and where they're going. So when you get the ball, you would be able to decide here, what would be the best person to pass to in order to, improve the chances here that somebody might score. So basically that idea, and the same way that musicians, when they're actually reading a piece of music, they can hear it in their head and now actually think about, well, if I do this, then it's going to sound a little bit like that. So basically that ability of actually mentally being able to, and not being dependent here on actually, the immediate experience and basically relying on intuition. We argue that those representations, seems to be the key to identify individuals who are improving, because once they fail, they're able to now try to figure out what they need to change. If you're just relying on your intuition and you fail, what do? There's really nothing for you to sort of actively manipulate.
So overall, if you want to improve, you got to build mental representation, so in your head, like you can imagine what you've been doing, so you know what you can do better.
Right. And I guess I would argue that the key word for experts is control. So an expert actually doesn't have just one way of reacting to a situation. They can actually think through different options, and basically, so when they're practicing, they wouldn't just do the same thing. They would actually vary. So they actually now have tools. So if something happens, and maybe, if you're playing tennis and the weather changes, so the wind is changing, it's not like you're just going to keep playing your automatic thing that you would be playing without the wind. You can actually make adjustments. We know that musicians, when they actually play in different kind of audio places, there's going to be different acoustics, and they can actually modify now the way they're playing in a way to sort of maximize the experience of the audience. So that idea here that an expert is actually able to manipulate and make adjustments, and I think in virtually any sport that's being done outdoors, weather, temperature, maybe even your kind of what happened, if there's a delay and stuff like that, experts need to be able to kind of handle all those variations. And that really is, at least what we've found, the hallmark of somebody who is really superior.
So I was wondering, can you apply the concepts, because you talk a lot about sports and like chess and mathematicians. How can you apply that to an office job like marketing or sales? I guess this would be super interesting to know for a lot of people. How can they apply deliberate practice for those kinds of jobs?
Well, I've been talking now to several companies where they're interested in exactly this. How would we be able to kind of allow individuals who've been actually at a job now for several years, how would they be able to kind of, do even better? And basically, one of the things that we have, tried out is this idea that if you're doing the same job as a lot of other people, it's possible now to identify people who seem to be more successful here in either closing sales or basically having individuals that they work with rate them extremely highly here in terms of their experience of actually working with the salesperson. And by basically now identifying those individuals and actually videotape their interactions with a client, and then basically kind of allowing for a subsequent analysis of what it is that's happening, you would then be able to allow other individuals to kind of see, and sometimes you can actually have those videos and stop them when something unexpected happens in the interaction, and now see what would they do if that kind of thing happened to them. And then you can actually see now somebody who was able to do something that eventually led to a very successful outcome.
Cool. I think a lot of people have an inspiration to do something, like to become an expert in something. Let's say master a sports, master a martial art, become really good at writing, or become a really good scientist or student. And then people start executing on it. But I think a lot of people have this challenge that they don't continue to practice or to work on it. So how can people stay motivated and keep practicing that specific skill?
Well, I think what I'm right now very interested in and trying to encourage people is to document their entire trajectory. So if you basically wanted to start with a project, I guess we would want to know here, what is your starting point? I mean, do you have a lot of skills and knowledge that already you have acquired? And then basically try to, almost with a video diary, track on a weekly or monthly basis how you actually improve and what are the basically motivational obstacles that you face. And I think by actually learning now from those individuals who are successful what the problems are. I remember when I actually read these biographies of people that I really admired, what I was struck by was how many times they actually were struggling, in the sense that it wasn't just smooth sailing. And I think some people, they like the smooth sailing, but I think that's kind of just a misrepresentation here of what it took. So the more that you will actually see that those people who actually went through a similar process that you're kind of starting on, what they actually went through, and also how long that process is. And I think that's one of the things that I think the 10,000 hour rule that Malcolm Gladwell made up based on our work, sort of makes it clear that, you know, you're not going to be an instant success. And if you have that expectation, you know, you're going to try and basically fail. So what you need, and often that's very helpful to have a teacher who could tell you, well, you know, you're doing just as well as such and such person. And I think it would be even more compelling if they could actually help you see a video of what that person was doing when they started, and now seeing what kind of changes they went through in order to get to that point.
Wow, that sounds like a really good tip. Awesome. So basically, yeah, you need someone who's like, let's say, 10 years ahead, and you need to see like where that person was struggling compared to where you are right now, right? And then you see like,
Exactly.
okay, I have to keep going. That person is successful now, but he also kept going.
Exactly. And I think that's why if you have a teacher who would be able to kind of map out what the path is, and I think that's one of the reasons why you're young, you may be more willing here to basically accept the fact that it's going to take a long time for you to get well. But let's assume now that basically if you're 25, you're not going to magically get good. Even the very best, say, 12-year-olds may actually go through a process where it takes them 5, 10 years to kind of reach a very high level. So if you're 25 years old and you haven't already, you know, basically started on that process, so you are almost there, you're going to have to do a lot of changes. And I think a lot of adults, they basically have the sense here, well, I'm an adult, so what more do I have to do here, you know? And I think that's the kind of conception that I find, you know, the worst. And also basically that idea that a lot of people who've been doing their job for 10 years, and I think that's where the 10,000 hour rule has misfired, because it's not doing something for 10 years that makes you into an expert automatically. It's basically that process by which you basically put in time every day, or at least every week, where you're actually trying out to improve something and doing that particular aspect of your job or what you're working on a little bit better.
Yeah, you mentioned the 10,000 hour rule now a couple of times. What was the original study, and what do you think about the 10,000 hour rule?
Well, so our study basically showed that when we analyzed musicians at a music academy that differed in their performance level that they exhibited, we found that when you look back on what they did before they joined this music academy, that there were basically differences in how much time they actually had spent on a daily basis, basically working on the kinds of things that their music teacher was basically instructing them and helping them setting goals for. So now the average of the top group at age 20 was actually 10,000. But basically, there was a lot of variability around that number. So this idea here that there's something magical with 10,000 hours, except that it's a huge, big number. So if you count up how many hours you actually need to work per day, you realize that it's a substantial number. And the musicians that we studied, they spent maybe about 20 hours a week basically engaging in this, solitary practice where they would try and improve. So that's basically about 3-4 hours a day, every day, weekends. Now, once you start realizing that in order to kind of be part of that music academy, you actually have to make that tremendous commitment to basically practice all through adolescence. That I think really shows the necessity here for you refining your performance. Even so, this idea that if you're talented enough, you just don't have to practice, I don't know that there's any evidence for that at all. What we found was that when you looked at the violinists or pianists who are competing in international competitions, they're pretty much in their early 30s when they typically win those competitions. So that's another basically 12, 15 years of training beyond when we actually tested them at age 20. So I think a good estimate is that they've probably engaged in about 25,000 hours of this solitary practice where you're actually trying to improve.
So yeah, it's kind of like 10,000 hours to become like an elite student, and then 15,000 to become like really world-class elite musician.
Well, that's basically, at least for piano, I've shown here that that is a reasonable estimate.
I guess you're familiar with the works of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and his concept of flow.
Yeah, yeah, I've sort of had a chance to kind of meet with Mihai several times.
Oh, cool. Because when I was reading your book, I saw some parallels, like the uninterrupted concentration and focus on one thing. And Mihai has this concept of the challenge skill ratio, which means you should always like have a challenge that's 4% higher than your current skill level. Maybe that's also kind of similar to deliberate practice. And also for flow, it's really important to have enough sleep and to live healthy so you can get more into flow. And I was wondering, how would you relate flow to your work?
Well, I think that's really interesting, and I believe that there is something when I've talked to individuals that seems to match his concept of flow. However, I don't think that flow actually you can have flow while you're engaging in deliberate practice. So basically, in order for you to successfully improve, you have to be attentive to all the things that you're actually trying to change. So I guess Mihai basically argued that once you don't know ever that you're in flow. So if you basically are realizing you're in flow, that actually means that you're no longer in flow, because basically that self-realization, is inconsistent with this flow experience. And typically the flow experience is you don't really have any memory for what happened. It's almost like you were just totally engaged in this activity, and somehow that then ends, and it's only like in retrospect that you know that you were in flow. I would argue that deliberate practice, you're actually going to be paying attention to a lot of things. And when we talk to experts, they actually can tell you about what they needed to do and what kind of adjustments and what they were paying attention to. So that's really inconsistent with this idea of flow. So what I basically would argue is flow is when you're actually performing, because at that point you're actually trying now to just execute what you've already worked on. You're not trying to kind of work and improve something while you're performing in front of an audience. You're basically fully focused on executing what you've learned. Now, most of the time when you execute something, there's going to be deviations and there are going to be things happening that forces you to make adjustments during performance. So at the end of a performance, you would be able to look back and see various things that didn't work out as well as you had hoped. On some occasions, you can perform so perfectly that there really isn't any of these kind of things that happen. And that gives you now almost a sense here that things went so well. And that means that there's really nothing for you to remember about the deviations, because it's almost like now that sort of, and it, given that you didn't have to make any corrections, it feels effortless. So when you're actually looking back on that performance, that is what I would basically refer to as flow, which is something, incidentally, that at least the people I talk to happens very, very rarely. So maybe it happens, like once a month or something for performing musicians.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. I would have thought it happens to them regularly.
Well, again, it probably depends very much here on how you define flow, because if you define flow as basically being fully focused and engaged in the activity. So you're actually not thinking about other things. Now, if you call that flow, then obviously that every time when you're engaging in purposeful and deliberate practice, you're in flow in that, according to that definition. But basically, that idea here of losing yourself, where you're actually no longer aware of, what you need to do and basically the things that you're attending to and so on, then I think you end up with a much rarer event.
And so the flow research, they also measure your brain, and they found out that it releases these neurochemicals in your brain. I was wondering, is there like similar research about the deliberate practice or purposeful practice? Have you measured people with EEGs and saw like what's going on in their brain and if they have like specific neurochemicals being released?
I don't know of any research like that, and I guess part of it is that if you basically now define activities that will change your performance, like a musician, it's going to be awfully hard to put somebody with a violin or a piano inside one of those, MRI apparatuses. I mean, you could conceivably put some EEG equipment on top of them, but then you really have to then basically, what is it that you're contrasting? And I think basically, and I'm not that familiar with exactly when the individuals were making the judgment about the flow, but obviously they wouldn't be able to kind of tell you when they're in flow, because basically, according to Csikszentmihalyi, that would actually, be inconsistent with being in flow. So I don't know exactly how you would collect that information from people to be able to know.
And do you know Cal Newport?
I've talked to him several times.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Cal Newport, the author of Deep Work. And I also saw some parallels again to your work. And I was wondering, maybe you have some thoughts on deep work and deliberate practice, how that overlaps.
Well, I think he even refers to deliberate practice as sort of an example here of his deep work. I think his book is great, and obviously focusing in on a little bit different aspects than we've been working with. But I don't really see a lot of kind of inconsistencies here between what he's calling deep work and basically that idea here of being fully engaged. And ideally, you would have, some very frequent feedback. So you, in some ways, would be getting evaluation on what you're doing and how that actually relates to your set goal here for how you want to change your performance.
Cool. So I have three quick questions at the end of our interview. And the first one is, what is the book that you have most gifted or most recommended besides your own books? And I see you have a lot of books in the background.
Yeah, I think I have about 16,000 books here between my office and my home. Now, if I was forced here to pick a book, I think I had a mentor, a Nobel Prize winner, Herbert Simon, that I worked with for 3 years in Pittsburgh. And he has basically autobiography, Models of My Life. That may be one of the books that I would basically point to as one of the, special books for me.
And if you imagine you could do a phone call to your 20-year-old self. So imagine you were 20, probably studying in Sweden, I guess. What advice would you give yourself? And can be anything like personal or business or scientific wise.
Well, I mean, in one sense, I would probably argue, and I remember when I was 20-year-old, I actually had the opportunity to work or meet some of the most famous psychology professors from the United States that were visiting University of Stockholm. And at the time, I actually was a double student. So I was actually studying at the Royal Institute of Technology to become basically a theoretical physicist. And I was studying psychology. And I remember basically this professor kind of telling me, wow, that's really amazing here that you're willing here to spend that much time going back and forth between these two schools. So, that basically is something that I think is boding well for you, and basically having that energy and directing it now to some interesting scientific research, you should be successful.
And if you would sum up your life's mission or your life purpose or what you want to change in the world, how would you sum it up in one sentence?
I think if I could help people realize what the tools are, the effective tools that they can use to actually improve their performance and acquire skills, that would be something I would be delighted and hopefully, would give those individuals who are sufficiently motivated a chance here to realize their goals with a higher success rate.
Anders, thank you so much for the interview and taking your time. I really appreciate it, and I think it will be really helpful for a lot of people that want to improve themselves. Where can people find out more about your work if they want to learn more about you?
Well, I would argue that maybe there is, I have a university website with a little information, but I would recommend maybe looking at the Peak book, which, with Robert Poole, I was basically trying to summarize what I thought was the most important of what I've learned here during the 40 years of studying expert performers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anders.
Well, it was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for this interview.
If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to learn more about expertise and peak performance, hit subscribe now. Let me know in the comments down below in what area you want to become an expert.